Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. Follow us on Instagram or Discord, links in the description. We're playing Doctor Who. First up is Scott, playing the 13th Doctor, looking to put +1/+1 counters on his stuff whenever he casts things from not his hand. Next up is me. I'm playing Davros, Dalek creator, looking to make swarms of Dalek and hopefully draw some cards or make people discard. Chris is playing the 4th Doctor, a synergistic deck looking to cast historic spells. He'll try to outvalue his opponents. And Matt is playing the 10th Doctor. This deck focuses on suspending all sorts of cards and then manipulating time counters. Playing these as slightly upgraded Precons. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat, Meatball. He's so chunky. Scott started things off with a Myriad Landscape. Passing to me, I played Storm Carved Coast as my land for turn before saying go to Chris. He drops Exotic Orchard as his land for turn. Hey, he can make blue. So he uses that to cast K9 Mark 1. While that's untapped, his things will have Ward, so that's cool. He passes the turn over to Matt. He draws and plays Trenzalore Clock Tower as his land before passing the turn back over to Scott. He draws and plays a Forest as his land. He passes the turn back over to me. I draw and play Command Tower as my land, and with nothing left to do, I pass over to Chris. He draws and plays Plains, and with that out, he'll cast his Doctor's Companion, Sarah Jane Smith. With her out, if he casts historic spells, he gets clues. He passes the turn over to Matt, who realizes later he should have tapped his Clock Tower. He draws and plays a Plains. He then casts his Doctor's Companion, Rose Tyler. So now he wants to have all sorts of things with time counters on it so she gets thick and swole. He passes over to Scott, who plays a Mountain as his land for turn. Then he activates his Myriad Landscape, sacking it and finding 2 lands. He passes the turn over to me. I play my own Exotic Orchard as my land, and then I cast the Toy Maker's Trap. At the beginning of your upkeep, secretly choose a number between 1 and 5 that hasn't been chosen. If you do, an opponent guesses which number you chose, then you reveal the number you chose. If it gets wrong, they lose life equal to the number they guessed, and you draw a card. If it gets right, sacrifice the Toy Maker's Trap. Chris plays Skycloud Expanse as his land for turn before Talisman of Unity. This will trigger his Doctor's Companion, getting him a clue, because that's what Sarah Jane Smith says to do. After that, he casts Bessie, the Doctor's Roadster. This is a hasty vehicle, so he'll go ahead and tap Sarah Jane in order to crew Bessie and smash into Matt for 3 points of damage. He then passes the turn over to Matt, who draws and plays Sundown Pass as his land for turn, featuring that really cool Doctor Who art. He then suspends Judon Enforcers. He then attacks me for absolutely no reason. Rose Tyler triggers, getting him a time counter on her, which means she gets +1/+1, so I'm down to 37. On Scott's turn, he plays a Forest as his land, and then he casts his commander, the 13th Doctor. So now when he starts casting things from not his hand, he gets a +1/+1 counter on a thing. He will foretell a card, and then he passes the turn over to me. On my upkeep, Toy Maker's Trap will trigger. I secretly choose a number. I have Matt be the guesser of the number, and he gets it wrong, so he'll take 2 points of life, and I get to draw a card, which is neat. I draw for turn, and then I play a Fancy Swamp as my land before casting my commander, Davros, Dalek creator. Now I'm motivated to make sure my opponents are losing at least 3 life. On Chris's turn, he casts his commander, the 4th Doctor, so now he can start peeping the scene on top of his library whenever he wants. Can you believe it? He then crews up Bessie and smacks Scott. He takes the damage and drops to 37. He then passes the turn over to Matt, who plays Deserted Beach as his land, and then he casts the Wedding of River Song. So he'll draw 2 cards. Then he'll get to suspend something, and he also chooses me to suspend a card as well. He suspends Astrid Peth, so that'll get suspended with 2 time counters on it, but then he gets to time travel, so he messes with all of his time counters. I put Dalek Squadron into suspension with 3 time counters on it. He then casts Clock Spinning at sorcery speed in order to mess with his time counters some more. He'll have Rose Tyler get a little bit bigger before attacking into Scott. This will trigger once again whenever she attacks, getting even bigger. Scott drops down to 28 after getting punched in the face by Rose. On Scott's turn, he draws, and then he casts his Doctor's Companion, Yasmin Khan. And when he casts that, the 13th Doctor gets a little bit bigger. He moves into combat, repaying Matt in kind, and dropping him down to 32. Then, on his end step, the 13th Doctor has a counter on it, so it untaps. Onto my turn, I tick down my time counters. Then the Toy Maker's Trap triggers once again. I choose 5, and Chris also chose 5, so it just goes away. Then I draw for turn, before dropping Darkwater Catacombs as my land. Afterwards, I move into the red zone, swinging Davros at Matt because Rose Tyler is getting pretty scary. In my second main phase, I cast Ensnared by the Mara. It's kind of like if Atali and Combustible Gear Hulk had a baby. Chris and Scott choose to take damage by revealing the top 4 cards of their library, taking damage equal to the mana value. And Matt says you can get a free card. In this case, it's a Thought Vessel. What? Chris got pretty lucky and only took 2 points of damage for my card, and Scott reveals much more mana value than that. He'll take 16 whole points of damage after revealing those 4 cards off the top of his library. Not bad. And he was like, how bad could it be? On my end step, Davros triggers, seeing that 2 opponents lost more than 3 life, so Matt and Scott both discard, and I get a Dalek. On Chris's turn, he draws, peeps the scene on top of his library, then casts an Unearthly Child. So he'll start revealing cards from the top of his library until he finds a Doctor or Doctor's Companion. In this case, he finds Tegan Jovanka, because it's a Doctor's Companion. And that goes to his hand, the other stuff goes in the bottom. He gets a clue, thanks to casting a historic spell. Then, once again, he'll crew Bessie, and this time Bessie will make the 4th Doctor unblockable, so he'll deal some damage to both Matt and myself. On Matt's turn, Astrid Peth loses that last pesky time counter and is cast. When that enters the battlefield, it gets a food. He then casts his commander, the 10th Doctor. Now, whenever he attacks, he'll get to suspend more. He does exactly that. He attacks his big scary Rose Tyler at Chris, triggering both Rose Tyler as well as the 10th Doctor. So he'll have the 10th Doctor resolve first, suspending a card. Therefore, Rose Tyler gets even bigger. And Chris declares no blocks, taking all the beats to his face, dropping down to 26. He passes to Scott. He plays an Arcane Signet in his first main phase. Afterwards, he activates Yasmin Khan, impulsively drawing the top card of his library. In this case, it's a land, so he'll just play that as his land for turn in the form of a Cinderglade, entering the battlefield untapped. He then casts Jenny Flint. Hey, that thing can get +1 counters too. He follows that up by casting his Foretold card, which is the Foretold Soldier. This triggers his commander, getting a +1/+1 counter on another creature. He puts it on Yasmin. He then moves into combat at Chris, picking on him, dropping to 23. On his end step, his commander triggers, everything with a +1 counter of his untaps. On my turn, I downtick my time counters, play Temple of the False God as my land, before casting one of the cutest artwork depictions of Solemn Simulacrum. This will have me go and find a land and put it onto the battlefield tapped, before moving into combat at Chris with Davros. Thanks to Menace, Chris can't do anything about it. He drops to 20 on my end step, Davros triggers, I get a Dalek, and Chris decides to discard. On Chris's turn, he somehow has a food token appear, which he corrects in a moment. He drew, triggered his saga, and revealed Jamie McCrimmon, which gets to go to his hand because it's a Doctor's Companion. He then Path to Exiles Matt's Rose Tyler. He found a mountain, and Chris followed that up by casting Thought Vessel. This will trigger his commander, getting him a clue. Then he found an ancient den off the top thanks to his 4th Doctor. That'll make him a food. He passes the turn over to Matt, who on his upkeep messes with all the time counters in the world. He draws and plays an island as his land before recasting Rose Tyler. As a follow-up play, he sacrifices his food token. This will trigger Astrid Peth, so he'll get to explore. It's not a land, so it stays on top, and he gets a +1 counter, but accidentally puts a +1 counter on Rose Tyler. It should have gone on Astrid Peth. He passes the turn over to Scott. He draws and activates Yasmin once again, exiling a card, which should have been face up, but he does show it's a Desolate Lighthouse and plays that for turn. Now this does not trigger his commander because it has to be a cast, not a play. He activates Yasmin once again, showing a forest. Afterwards, he suspends Search for Tomorrow. Then he casts Clara Oswald, which could be very terrifying. He's like a little Dr. Harmonicon. He moves to end step, untapping his Yasmin because she has a counter. I also cast Cyber Conversion, and I turned that Clara Oswald into a 2/2. Onto my upkeep, I remove the last time counter off of my Dalek Squadron, so that enters my battlefield, and I'm feeling pretty good. I draw, and then I cast Blink. I then not Chaos Warp Matt's Rose Tyler, because again, it's a pretty big threat pretty quickly, it seems. But hey, he gets a clue. I follow that up by moving my things into the red zone in a way that allows me to trigger my commander the most, which is just by attacking Matt. He decides to block my Sad Robot, which kills it, getting me a card draw. I move to end step, my commander will trigger, getting me another Dalek, and Matt had me draw a card. On to Chris's turn. His Saga triggers after he draws, and then he'll reveal a TARDIS off the top, which goes to his hand. Afterwards, he plays his own Trenzalore Clock Tower, then he casts the 7th Doctor. This will trigger Sarah Jane Smith, getting him another clue token. Afterwards, he casts TARDIS. Seeing as he has the 7th Doctor out, that thing could do some work if it gets the chance to attack. He then crews Bessie once again, also makes the 4th Doctor unblockable, and attacks me. I take my beats and drop down to 24. He passes the turn over to Matt, who fiddles with his time counters on his suspended cards once again. He casts Inspiring Refrain, so he'll draw 2 cards, and then that thing gets suspended as well. That's neat. He plays Port Town as his land for turn, entering the battlefield tapped because he doesn't reveal nothing. He then moves into combat, attacking with Astrid at Scott. This will trigger his commander, so he'll get to suspend a thing. Scott declares blocks with his The Foretold Soldier against Astrid, and because it's dealt damage, it gets foretold. Such theme. And Astrid dies. Then Matt moves into end step, and Scott activates Yasmin once again, so he puts a Preordain into exile. Onto Scott's turn proper, he ticks down a time counter on his suspended card, draws for turn, then activates Yasmin once again, revealing a Frostboil Snarl, and he just plays that from exile, entering the battlefield tapped. He then casts Throes of Chaos, cascading into a 3-drop or less from the top of his library, and he'll find a Memory Worm. So that will enter the battlefield, and his commander will trigger, getting a +1/+1 counter. With Memory Worm out, he'll cast Preordain from exile. This again triggers his commander, but also triggers Memory Worm. So he can have somebody discard a card, draw a card, and take 2 damage. Scott decides to have Matt be the victim of that. Once that's all resolved, Scott casts the Foretold Soldier once again from exile. This will yet again trigger his commander and Memory Worm, so he gets a +1/+1 counter on both. He'll choose me for Memory Worm's ability, so I take 2 and discard a card and draw a card. He moves into end step. His untappable things with counters untap, and on my turn I draw. Blink will trigger, getting me a 2/2 Alien Angel. Then I'd play Creeping Tar Pit as my land for turn before casting my own Thought Vessel, not the one Matt gave me, but my own. Then I cast the Beast, Deathless Prince. This thing enters the battlefield tapped, but I get to steal a thing from a player. In this case, I take Chris's the 7th Doctor, paying 1 for ward. Then I move into combat, triggering the 7th Doctor, get my myriad Daleks thanks to Dalek Squadron. Chris takes his beats, as does Matt. I choose Chris to resolve the 7th Doctor's ability. He guessed correctly, so I get a clue token. Pretty easy to do with all the artifacts I have out. I move into end step, getting another Dalek, thanks to my commander. Chris decides to let me draw, while Matt decides to discard. I give back the 7th Doctor to Chris. He draws for turn, peeps the scene, and then he casts Traverse Eternity. So he'll get to draw 5 whole cards from that bad boy. He then plays a command tower as his land, again peeping the scene, and then he'll cast Alistar, the Brigadier. This triggers Sarah Jane Smith, getting him yet another clue token. Then he activates Bessie once again by crewing it with Sarah and making the 7th Doctor unblockable. He attacks me. I want to stem some of the bleeding, so I use one of my Daleks to block Bessie, but take the beats from the 7th Doctor. He then passes the turn over to Matt, who once again ticks down his time counters, and he gets a Judon Enforcers onto the battlefield, as well as casts Coward. He targets Scott's the 13th Doctor, but the real purpose for him casting that was to time travel, so he messes with his time counters once again. All of that was on his upkeep, so he draws for turn. He casts the Parting of the Ways. He'll get to exile the top 5 cards of his library, and for each that's not a land, he gets to suspend that. 3 of them were lands. Sorry, Matt. But hey, he got an As Foretold and a Soul Ring to exile. Speaking of early game ramp, he gets an Arcane Signet out onto the battlefield, and he suspends Ecstatic Beauty as well. He moves into combat, swinging his commander at me. This will allow him to suspend a card off the top of his library. At this point, I just have to take the damage and drop to 16. He passes the turn, and on his end step, Scott once again activates Yasmin, exiling a card, and then onto his turn proper, he'll tick down Search for Tomorrow on his upkeep. This will have him go find a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield. That was cast from exile, so it triggers his commander and Memory Worm, so he throws around a couple of +1 counters and deals Chris 2 points of damage, making him discard and draw. And that was all on Scott's upkeep as well. He draws for turn, and then he'll get to play a land from exile. In this case, it's Storm Carved Coast. That doesn't trigger his stuff, but hey, it's a land. He casts Confession Dial afterwards, so he'll get to surveil 3 cards, and he puts all 3 of those into the bin. At this point, he does have a legendary card in there, so he activates Confession Dial, which gives Danny Pink Escape. He'll pay its mana value, as well as exile 3 cards from the graveyard. And because he casts that from the graveyard, this will trigger Memory Worm and his commander. Chris takes 2 more life, discards a card, and draws. Then Scott casts Think Twice, but he's casting it with Flashback from his graveyard. So once again, this will trigger Memory Worm and his commander, and allow him to draw a card. He deals 2 more points of damage to Chris, knocking him out of the game. Sorry, Chris. Scott finishes resolving some of his triggers while Chris cleans up his board. Then Scott moves into the red zone, attacking at me. On combat, Jenny Flint will trigger, and Scott has enough power on board to knock me out of the game. If only I held up blockers. Oh well. Scott and I clean up our boards, and then onto Matt's turn. During his upkeep, he gets a free Soul Ring from exile, as well as an Inspiring Refrain and Donna Noble. He then ticks down the rest of his time counters on his suspended cards. He gets to draw cards thanks to Inspiring Refrain, and draw for turn as well. Inspiring Refrain goes right back into exile with 3 time counters on it. The Parting of Ways ticks up, so he gets to time travel and time travel. So he messes with those time counters all over again. He gets As Foretold out onto the battlefield, as well as RMS Titanic. Can throw a punch and then die. His land for turn, he plays Temple of the False God. Then Matt activates the timey-wimey activated ability of his commander, therefore time traveling. So he'll mess with all the time counters that he has once again, casting Ecstatic Beauty, as well as Inspiring Refrain 1 more time. That goes back to exile with 3 more suspend counters on it. Then he exiles 3 additional cards, and he could play those until end of turn. As a follow-up, he casts Gallifrey Falls, having it deal 4 damage to each creature, but should they die, they'll exile instead. In response, Scott activated Yasmin, exiling a card once again. Then all the things that can die will die. So Scott loses a few creatures, Matt lost 1, and Matt's hoping that the brakes have been pumped enough to slow Scott down. On Scott's turn, he draws, and then he casts Flatline. So each one of Matt's creatures becomes a 0/1 until end of turn. And to make matters worse, Scott casts Impending Flux. This will deal 1 damage to all of Matt's creatures, as well as his face. With the doors knocked down, Scott moves into combat, dealing enough points of damage to knock Matt out of the game, making Scott the winner. Congratulations, buddy. And as promised, here's Meatball. He's so chunky. And there you have it. That's the game. Let us know what you thought about this Doctor Who game in the comments. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow us on Instagram and Discord. And as always, thank you for watching.